The attention mismatch, why phones and classrooms can't coexist, becomes visible when a 15-year-old student checks their glowing screen. This quiet movement happens every few minutes, while a sympathetic teacher explains a complex historical concept to the class. Research shows that every digital interruption forces the human brain to pay a heavy price in cognitive switching costs. Scientists observe that students who frequently toggle between apps often struggle to regain their original depth of academic focus. Why does the modern classroom environment feel so fundamentally incompatible with the rapid pace of our digital social lives? The phone isn't just a distraction sitting on a desk. It's a portal trained to reward the fastest possible shift in attention. Outside that classroom, every app, every feed, every notification is engineered to deliver something new before the last thing fully lands. The classroom asks for something almost opposite: slow accumulation, patience, and the willingness to sit with difficulty before understanding arrives. That gap between those two environments isn't a failure of effort on anyone's part. It's a structural mismatch hiding in plain sight. Understanding it starts with how digital environments actually shape the way attention moves. The environment students carry in their pockets is, by design, the opposite of patient. And the classroom asks them to be patient for 50 uninterrupted minutes at a time. It asks them to hold one idea in mind, without interruption, long enough for that idea to take root. That kind of attention has a name in cognitive science. It's called sustained attention, and it's metabolically expensive for the brain. Unlike scrolling a feed, where the next thing arrives before the last one fades, a lecture builds meaning across minutes, not milliseconds. A student following an explanation about photosynthesis or the French Revolution must hold earlier information active while absorbing new information on top of it. That's not passive reception. It's an ongoing act of mental construction that demands continuous effort. The classroom also moves at a fixed pace, set by the teacher, not by the student's own tolerance for difficulty. There's no refresh button, no skip, no algorithm quietly sensing when engagement drops and serving something easier. The material doesn't adapt to the moment. The student has to. And that gap between what the environment demands and what the brain has been trained to expect is where the struggle quietly begins. Every time a student glances at their phone and then back at the board, something measurable happens in their brain. Psychologists call it a task-switching cost, and it's not a metaphor for lost focus. It's a documented performance penalty. Research by David Meyer and colleagues found that switching between tasks can consume as much as 40% of productive thinking time. That number doesn't describe distraction in some vague sense. It describes the mental overhead of re-engaging a task you just abandoned. The brain has to reload context, suppress the previous thread, and rebuild the cognitive frame it was holding before. Each switch isn't just a pause, it's a small act of reconstruction that takes real time and real accuracy. Studies consistently show that error rates climb after a switch, even when people feel like they've returned to full attention. That feeling of being back on track arrives before the brain actually is, which is the quiet part of the problem. A single phone check during a lecture can cost a student far more than the seconds they spent looking at the screen. The research on devices and academic performance is consistent enough to take seriously, but complicated enough to handle carefully. Studies tracking college students in real classrooms found that those who used phones more frequently during lectures scored lower on end-of-term exams. The association held even after controlling for prior academic ability and general motivation levels. Researchers at the University of Texas found that the mere presence of a smartphone on a desk reduced available working memory, even when the phone was silent. That effect didn't require a single notification. Just the object sitting there was enough to pull cognitive resources away. A large meta-analysis published in 2020 reviewed dozens of studies and found a reliable negative relationship between device use and learning outcomes. But correlation is not causation, and the researchers were careful to say so. Students who struggle academically may also reach for their phones more often, reversing the assumed direction of the effect. The data doesn't tell us that devices broke something. It tells us that divided attention has a measurable cost. What's harder to measure is the classroom experience that cost is quietly reshaping every single day. The data confirms what teachers have been saying quietly for years, often to each other. A 2023 Pew Research survey found that nearly 3 in 4 teachers called smartphone distraction a major problem in their classrooms. It isn't a complaint, it's a signal from the people closest to the problem every single day. Teachers, teachers describe a specific, exhausting pattern. A student appears present, but their attention is somewhere else entirely. The phone doesn't have to be visible for the pull to be real, because the anticipation of a notification is itself distracting. Educators report spending meaningful portions of class time managing devices rather than teaching the material they prepared. That's instructional time, irreplaceable, finite, quietly draining away without anyone declaring a crisis. School leaders have begun responding, pushing for clearer policies, but the classroom reality often moves faster than any policy can. What makes this genuinely hard is that no one in the room chose this situation, and no one benefits from pretending it isn't there. The pressure on teachers is real, and it points directly toward a debate that schools can no longer avoid. Removing the phone from the room is the most obvious lever schools have, and some are pulling it. France banned smartphones in schools nationwide in 2018, and several districts across the United States have followed with their own restrictions. Early evidence suggests these bans do reduce distraction during class and can modestly improve academic outcomes for some students. But a phone ban addresses the trigger, not the underlying pattern that the trigger has already shaped over years. A student who has spent thousands of hours in fast, fragmented digital environments doesn't suddenly recover deep focus when the device disappears from their pocket. The habit of switching, the low tolerance for sustained effort, the pull toward novelty, those travel with the student into every classroom, phone or no phone. Bans may buy teachers a quieter room, but a quieter room is not the same as an attentive one. The real question isn't whether to remove the distraction, it's how to rebuild the capacity that fragmented attention has quietly been eroding. The easiest response to this problem is to point at someone and assign fault. Teachers blame distracted students, parents blame irresponsible teenagers, and administrators blame everyone except the systems they built. But blame is a way of stopping thought exactly when thought is most needed. The attention gap isn't a character flaw distributed unevenly across a generation of young people. It's the predictable output of two competing environments pulling on the same brain in opposite directions. One environment was engineered by some of the best behavioral scientists in the world to maximize engagement at any cost. The other was designed decades ago around a fundamentally different model of how learning and focus actually work. When those two systems collide inside a single student, the friction isn't surprising, it's inevitable. Shifting from blame to design means asking who built these conditions and what incentives shaped every decision along the way. That question lands differently when you're 15 years old and living inside both worlds at once. Before first period even starts, she's already made dozens of small mental shifts between apps, feeds, and notifications. Each shift feels effortless in the moment. A quick tap, a scroll, a reply, and then she's moving again. But the cognitive cost of that switching doesn't disappear when she walks through the classroom door. She sits down, opens her notebook, and the teacher begins. And now the environment asks something completely different of her. It asks her to hold one idea in mind for 45 uninterrupted minutes without a single refresh. That's not a punishment, it's just the nature of deep learning, and it's genuinely hard after a morning of rapid context switching. Research on task switching suggests that even brief mental interruptions can extend the time needed to fully re-engage with a demanding task. By the time she's navigated 6 periods, the cumulative weight of that daily back and forth is real and largely invisible to everyone around her. She isn't distracted because she's careless. She's caught between two environments that make completely opposite demands on her attention. This tension doesn't stay inside the classroom once the final bell rings and students leave. Adults sit through hour-long meetings, phones face down on the table, fighting the same pull. A parent tries to read a full article and finds their eyes drifting before the third paragraph ends. Someone sits across from a friend at dinner and catches themselves mentally rehearsing what to check when they get home. The classroom is just the place where this mismatch becomes visible, because the rules require you to stay still and pay attention. Everywhere else, you can quietly surrender without anyone noticing the drift. Work, meals, conversations, quiet evenings? The same fragmented rhythm follows people out of every door. Researchers who study attention describe this not as a personal failure, but as a learned response to an environment that rewards constant switching. The phone didn't build a different brain, it built a different habit, one that now runs in the background of nearly every waking hour. That habit didn't emerge by accident, it was carefully, deliberately designed to. The phone isn't winning by accident. It's winning because it was designed to win, against everything else competing for attention. Every notification, every scroll, every autoplay video is the output of deliberate engineering aimed at one goal. That goal isn't connection, or information, or entertainment, though it delivers all three as a byproduct. The real target is your attention itself, captured and held as long as the system can manage it. Classrooms weren't built with that kind of opposition in mind, and they've never had to be before now. A teacher preparing a lesson on photosynthesis isn't optimizing for dopamine loops or variable reward schedules. She's just teaching. The asymmetry isn't a failure of effort on either side. It's a structural mismatch between two very different kinds of environments. One environment adapts to you in real time, learning what keeps you engaged and serving more of it. The other holds still, asks you to come to it, and trusts that the content is worth the effort. Understanding why that gap exists means looking more closely at what the classroom actually offers. That student staring at their phone isn't lazy, and the teacher losing the room isn't failing at their job. What's happening in that classroom is a collision between two systems built on entirely different rules. One system rewards patience, depth, and the slow accumulation of meaning over a full hour. The other delivers novelty, reward, and stimulation in bursts measured in seconds, not minutes. The student sitting there has spent years training inside that second system, often without choosing to. So when the classroom asks for sustained, quiet focus, it's asking for something that genuinely competes with deeply practiced habits. That's not an excuse, and it's not a diagnosis. It's a structural description of what's actually in the room. The phone isn't winning because the student is weak. It's winning because it was designed to win against exactly this kind of environment. Seeing that clearly doesn't remove the problem, but it does change where you look for the solution. When we stop asking who's to blame, we can finally ask what can actually be changed. The mismatch between fragmented digital environments and sustained classroom focus is a design problem, and design problems have design solutions. Schools that have experimented with phone-free periods report something teachers describe as a slow exhale, a return of ambient quiet. That quiet isn't nostalgia, it's the precondition for the kind of thinking classrooms were built to develop. Structuring lessons around shorter attention cycles, with deliberate re-engagement points, works with how attention actually moves rather than against it. Honest conversations between teachers and students about why focus feels hard become possible once difficulty isn't treated as a character flaw. Parents who understand the pull of notification design can set boundaries that feel reasoned rather than arbitrary or punitive. None of this requires rejecting technology or pretending the last decade didn't reshape how young people experience time. What it requires is treating the environment as something we chose, and therefore, something we can choose differently. That reframing doesn't resolve the tension, but it does make the tension something worth working with. The mismatch between phones and classrooms isn't a crisis waiting to be solved. It's a condition we're learning to live with. Digital platforms won't stop competing for student attention, and classrooms won't stop requiring the kind of focus that resists interruption. Understanding that gap changes how we see the struggle, but it doesn't dissolve the tension underneath it. Every generation of students will arrive in school shaped by whatever attention environment surrounded them growing up. The platforms shaping that environment today are more deliberate, more responsive, and more relentless than anything that came before them. Teachers are being asked to hold focus in rooms where focus has never been harder to hold, and that's not a failure of effort on anyone's part. Students aren't broken, and neither are their teachers. They're both caught inside a system that wasn't designed with their relationship in mind. What makes this tension durable is that the forces driving it keep getting stronger, not weaker. The question worth sitting with isn't whether this will resolve, but how we navigate it with clear eyes. That mismatch between phones and classrooms didn't happen by accident, and it wasn't inevitable either. The devices students carry were built by teams of engineers whose entire job was capturing human attention as efficiently as possible. Every notification, every scroll, every autoplay decision reflects a deliberate design choice made in a boardroom, not a classroom. The variable reward of a new like, a new comment, a new video is the same mechanism that makes slot machines so hard to walk away from. Classrooms offer none of that. They offer something slower, harder, and ultimately more valuable. But slow and hard don't compete well against systems optimized for instant gratification at every single moment. Understanding why phones win that competition so reliably means looking closely at the engineering behind them. The features that feel intuitive were tested, refined, and deployed specifically because they work on human psychology. That's not a conspiracy, it's a business model, and it shapes every hour students spend in school. So we come back to that 15-year-old, phone face down on the desk, still pulling at them. They're not broken, and they're not lazy, and they're not choosing distraction over learning out of contempt. They've spent years inside systems engineered to make switching feel rewarding and stillness feel a cost. The classroom asks them to hold a single thread of thought for 40 minutes straight, without novelty, without feedback, without the small dopamine hits their attention has learned to expect. That's not a character flaw. That's a mirror between two very different environments. The teacher standing at the front is navigating the same friction, trying to hold a room that was trained somewhere else entirely. Neither of them designed this situation, and neither of them can simply will their way out of it. What changes things isn't blame. It's understanding exactly how that pull was built into the device in the first place. And that design is worth looking at very closely. You've been watching The Human Operating System. Thanks for thinking with us.